The history of makeup is a story that needs to be told. Just like everything else that our society has branded as feminine, makeup has been historically dismissed as shallow, as an artifice of vanity. But I promise you, it is so much deeper than that. Every tube of lipstick exists at the confluence of war, capitalism, gender, and science. We'll begin our journey with the meteoric rise of the modern cosmetics industry. How did the makeup industry go from a tiny fledgling operation relegated to the shadows of the Victorian era to a booming capitalist venture during the 1920s? Welcome to A Century of Makeup, a series that explores a critical history of cosmetics over the last 100 years. I'm Taipei, and for our first episode, let's dance our way back to the Roaring '20s. So here's the thing, the 1920s is only interesting if you understand the years leading up to it. Sure, you could make that argument for any period in history, but in my opinion, the most compelling narrative emerges when you understand how different cosmetics were during the Victorian era, and how the first 2 decades of the 20th century set the stage for the makeup revolution. All of that is to say, we have to go back in time. Makeup is not a modern invention. We have evidence of the ancient Egyptians using makeup as far back as 4000 BCE. Within the Western world, makeup has gone through multiple trend cycles over the centuries, falling in and out of public favor. Of all of these cycles, perhaps the lowest one was during the Victorian era, which lasted from 1837 to 1901. To understand the moral panic targeted at makeup, let's take a look at The Arts of Beauty by Lola Montez, published in 1858.
If Satan has ever had any direct agency in inducing woman to spoil or deform her own beauty, it must have been in tempting her to use paints and enameling. Ladies ought to know that it is a sure spoiler of the skin, and good taste ought to teach them that it is a frightful distorter and deformer of the natural beauty of the human face divine.
Needless to say, makeup was heavily stigmatized during this time. So did everyone stop wearing it? No, of course not. People would purchase ingredients and then use at-home recipes to create their own DIY skincare creams and cosmetics. So the Victorians did wear makeup, but they had to apply it discreetly. Wearing heavy makeup in public was totally unacceptable, with the only exceptions being actors and prostitutes. But as the Victorian era thaws out and we move into the early 20th century, public attitudes towards makeup begin to change. In England and France, women begin to wear makeup in imitation of the glamorous Queen Alexandra. And in the more conservative United States, rouge, what we now call blush, was available in the Sears and Roebuck catalog as early as 1900. There were also key technological changes. The introduction of incandescent lighting completely transformed the look and feel of stage productions, which were previously dimly lit by gas lamps. Immensely popular Orientalist stage productions, like the Ballet Russe, were not only a source of makeup inspiration for the public, but also a hotbed for innovation in products such as grease paint. The first 14 years of the 20th century set the precedents for greater public acceptance of wearing makeup. But with that said, the dominant Gibson girl beauty standard at the time was still ultra-natural, even if she was more willing to admit to her use of cosmetics compared to her tight-lipped Victorian predecessor. But in order to make the leap from Gibson girl to flapper, Western society would shatter into a million pieces. If you'd like to see more of this content, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing to the channel. It's totally free, and it really helps me out. And if you'd prefer to support my work directly and gain access to exclusive content, you can also check out the Patreon. It's impossible to overstate the impact of World War I on the Western world. Lasting from 1914 to 1918 and claiming more than 20 million lives, the Great War transformed every aspect of society. This included transforming gender roles and the chemical manufacturing industry, both of which would set the stage for the impending makeup revolution. Because so many men were drafted into the army, women took on new roles in the workforce that were previously unavailable to them. Women worked as ammunition testers, telephone operators, ambulance drivers, and more. This was a huge shock to patriarchal society. This massive influx of women into male-dominated workplaces had a lasting impact on society's views towards gender roles. Many women continued to work after the war and therefore had more disposable income. With more money in their pockets, women became a more powerful consumer class, which fueled post-war industries, especially cosmetics. World War I also fueled the flames of the American women's suffrage movement. The movement had been ongoing since the mid-19th century, and women's contributions to the war became a major component of its rhetoric. And after decades of organizing, the 19th Amendment was finally ratified in 1920. The 19th Amendment outlawed denying the right to vote on the basis of sex. However, most women of color would continue to be disenfranchised on the basis of their race for decades to come. But despite its limited scope, the 19th Amendment set the tone for rapidly changing gender roles during the 1920s. This would be the final nail in the coffin for any lingering anti-makeup propaganda left over from the Victorian era. World War I's impact on gender roles helps to explain the increased acceptance of and demand for makeup during the 1920s, but it would also transform the global chemical manufacturing industry's ability to supply cosmetics. Prior to World War I, Germany had a near monopoly over the production of many important chemicals like dyes and fertilizers. Farmers in the United States relied on these German chemicals, but the war led to naval blockades that disrupted international trade routes. So, in order to meet the domestic demand for agricultural chemicals, the American chemical manufacturing industry had to massively expand its capacity. In addition to civilian chemical needs, World War I also increased the demand for lethal chemicals. Chemical products were needed for both munitions and horrible chemical weapons like chlorine and mustard gas. The large-scale use of chemical weapons during World War I had a devastating human impact and set a terrible precedent for their continued use up until the present day. Alright, Taipei, so what on earth does all of that have to do with makeup? Well, to produce makeup, you need chemicals. After World War I was over, the chemical manufacturing industries in both the United States and Germany had grown their capacity so much, but there was no longer a demand for lethal chemicals. So, these companies shifted their production over to civilian products, including chemicals like emollients and colorants that are used in makeup. In other words, World War I catalyzed changes in the chemical industry that facilitated an explosion of cosmetics manufacturing during the 1920s. With the war finally over, the social, economic, and industrial conditions were perfect for a makeup revolution. The fledgling cosmetics industry was ready to flap its way into the roaring 20s. But how? But oddly enough, even in modern times, cosmetics still cause a lift of the eyebrows in some circles. Our older generation shudders at our younger generation's frank use of the lipstick. But that very frankness makes a lipstick virtuous. If we rouge our cheeks and powder our noses before every mirror we meet in public, there can be no turpitude in that. Our Victorian grandmothers, who bled themselves in private to be pale, were more vicious. Dorothy Cook's Etiquette of Beauty, 1927. World War I had created a perfect storm for a massive demand for cosmetics. In the late 20s, an ad agency claimed that American women used 3,000 miles of lipstick a year, 375 million boxes of face powder, and 240 million cakes of dry rouge. While it's impossible to verify the accuracy of this claim, the point is that the cosmetics industry experienced explosive growth during the 1920s. In order to accomplish this, it needed to fully transform from its shadowy Victorian past. The rapidly growing cosmetics industry posed a unique opportunity for women entrepreneurs. Cosmetics had been a historically neglected field, so at the end of World War I, two women were poised to fill this niche, Elizabeth Arden and Helena Rubinstein. The pair had many parallels in their lives and careers, and their fierce professional competition has even been the subject of a Broadway musical. Arden and Rubinstein both created cosmetic empires in the US and Europe, but they didn't just sell products, they pioneered the beauty salon industry. I'm not sure that this concept really exists anymore, but the beauty parlors of the 1920s provided an all-inclusive experience, with exercise classes, skin treatments, hair care, and makeup instruction, all under one roof. This marked a transition from makeup just being a product you would buy and use, to makeup as an immersive experience. The United States was still heavily segregated at this time, and much of the beauty industry exclusively made products for white women. The Black American beauty industry was pioneered by several Black women entrepreneurs, including Madam C.J. Walker. After suffering from hair loss during the 1890s, Madam C.J. Walker began selling hair products door to door, originally for another Black hair entrepreneur, Annie Malone. What began as a one-person, door-to-door operation soon became a national beauty enterprise. While Madam C.J. Walker began her career selling hair products, her company also expanded to include skincare and cosmetics that were specifically tailored for the needs of Black women. This business made Walker the wealthiest African-American businesswoman by the late 1910s, and she would use much of her fortune to fight for civil rights causes, including anti-lynching legislation. Madam C.J. Walker would pass away in 1919, but her daughter, Alila Walker, continued to run the business through the 1920s. Throughout the decade, her brand would expand to multiple countries throughout the Caribbean and Central America, and help to set the foundation for the Black cosmetics industry moving forward. Alongside these women entrepreneurs who are pioneering the consumer-facing cosmetics industry, makeup artists in Hollywood were innovating product formulations and application techniques. The growing popularity of silent films created new challenges that 19th century stage makeup couldn't handle. Due to technical limitations, filmmakers needed to use extremely bright lights, which would often melt traditional grease paint formulations. If your makeup melted a bit during a stage production, it wasn't a huge deal, because the audience was super far away. But in a movie, the camera is much closer to your face, and if your makeup changes, it'll create continuity issues. Max Factor was among the most innovative early Hollywood makeup artists. He developed a flexible grease paint formulation in 1914 that stood up better under the hot lights, and allowed actors to make dramatic facial expressions without worrying about their makeup cracking. Max Factor would also pioneer the bee-stung lip. The grease paints that were used for lipstick at the time tended to bleed, so Max Factor would draw on an exaggerated cupid's bow and then keep the lip shape extremely thin towards the corners of the mouth. This is just one of many examples of innovation, not just in products, but also in makeup application. We've discussed how the 1920s brought innovation to the production, distribution, and application of makeup. But for the average makeup user, how do they know how to apply these new products or follow these new trends? You may recall that during the Victorian era, many of those DIY recipes and discrete application techniques were passed down along family lines. This familial system broke down during the 1920s. Both products and application techniques were changing at an unprecedented rate, so the makeup industry needed a new way to disseminate makeup education. Just as we have online makeup tutorials today, people of the 1920s had beauty editors. By the mid-1920s, most magazines and newspapers had beauty editors or columns. Rather than scrolling on social media, people of the 1920s could open up Harper's Bazaar and read The Cosmetic Urge to learn about the latest products, techniques, and trends. For example, we can see how Max Factor's bee-stung lip trickled down to regular people. As French Vogue writes, "A large mouth is never painted to its end. A small mouth is always lined until the corners." This trend of disseminating makeup information through print media wasn't limited to the West. In Japan, Shiseido was leading the way for the burgeoning Japanese makeup industry. Their rainbow-colored face powder, released in 1917, revolutionized the local makeup scene at the time, when most face powders were still white. Japanese makeup users needed their own makeup publications, so in 1924, Shiseido launched their monthly journal, or Geppo. The Geppo was a part of a much larger trend of westernization in Japan, and it was one important vessel for transmitting Western makeup trends to the Japanese public. But not everything was sunshine and rainbow powder. The makeup industry had grown so quickly during the 1920s that governments couldn't keep up, leading to toxic products staying on shelves. The FDA was established in 1906 to regulate food and drugs, but the agency wouldn't gain authority over cosmetics until 1938. In the interim, many cosmetics continued to use dangerous ingredients, including mercury, belladonna, and lead. The use of lead-containing face powders was even a leading cause of infant mortality in Japan. The 1920s was truly the Wild West for the global cosmetics industry. It spurred economic opportunity, artistic innovation, and an information revolution. All that industry stuff is important, but it doesn't paint a complete picture of the cultural discourse centered around makeup. To understand how 1920s ideas about race, gender, and morality were intertwined with makeup, we need to turn our eyes towards the stars. Examining 1920s aspirational images makes it obvious how revolutionary the decade was. The Gibson girl and ingenue of the early 20th century was demure and natural. The flappers of the 1920s were bold and untamed, an attitude which they communicated through makeup. These archetypes were primarily spearheaded by stage and screen stars. We'll explore 3 case studies to better understand how beauty icons of the 1920s shaped makeup trends and cultural discourse. The vamp, short for vampire, was a popular silent film archetype that is still a part of our cultural lexicon. The character was first conceptualized by Fox Studios to promote the actress Theda Bara in 1915. It was a racist and Orientalist caricature that played on negative stereotypes of women from MENA and East Asia. Vamps like Theda Bara were portrayed as sexually deviant and exotic, and many of their films ended with the vamp dying of suicide. Equally as significant as the character traits of the vamp was her look. Orientalist costumes and unkempt hair were paired with extremely dramatic makeup, featuring blown-out smoky eyes. Silent film makeup does tend to be dramatic, but it's my personal theory that this eye makeup specifically was intended to be a caricature of MENA women's features, similar to how makeup was used for both blackface and yellowface. Some of the most famous vamp actresses went so far as to impersonate other ethnicities off-screen. Theda Bara was born Theodosia Burr Goodman, and apparently took on the stage name Theda Bara as an anagram of Arab death. Even though she was born to European immigrants in Cincinnati, Ohio, her publicist claimed that she was the daughter of an Arab sheik. Another famous vamp, this time from the 1920s, was Pola Negri. She promoted her exotic image by claiming that she was Romani, but she was actually just Polish. The vamp's dramatic style of makeup was, and is, hugely influential, but it's critical to understand its origins as a racist impersonation of women of color. Ironically, today the vamp makeup look is one of the most widely known references from 1920s makeup culture, and it's sometimes used to just refer to a smoky eye and a dark lip. The problematic connotations of this term, and therefore the accompanying makeup look, seem to have been lost to time. Our next makeup icon deserves more nuance. In the early 1920s, Josephine Baker was a young dancer from St. Louis, struggling to make it big in New York City. Her luck would change in 1925, when she was scouted to join an all-black show in Paris. In Europe at the time, there was a popular obsession with African art and culture. In a similar vein as Orientalism, this trend ranged from artistic inspirations to racist caricatures made through a Western lens. Josephine Baker's act capitalized on this trend. She danced a frenetic danse sauvage, often appearing topless, wearing a skirt made of artificial bananas. The performance played off of racist stereotypes of African women, as savage and hypersexual, and while it was undoubtedly problematic, it was different from blackface. While blackface makeup is used to portray a mockery of Black people, Josephine Baker's makeup was extremely contemporary and glamorous. She did her makeup herself, and at a time when there were limited options for darker skin, she crafted a custom powder formulation to match her skin tone. Josephine Baker's performances were wildly successful, and she would go on to become an international superstar in France and across Europe. Her look, which included her signature makeup, became an aspirational image in Europe, with Baker endorsing various makeup and hair products. All this at a time when almost all mainstream beauty icons in Europe were white. Josephine Baker would continue to have a fascinating life as an entertainer and civil rights icon. We're only covering her rise to fame during the 1920s, but I'll have some resources linked in the description for you to learn more about her. Finally, no discussion of the 1920s is complete without mentioning the flapper. During the 1920s, the term flapper was used very broadly to describe a young woman who rebelled against traditional gender roles and loved to have fun. It's very difficult to nail down exactly what made you a flapper in real life, but what is easier is to define the flapper archetype that was present in silent films. Clara Bow may be the most iconic flapper of the silent film era. In the smash hit 1927 film It, she exemplified the on-screen flapper, a young working woman with a rebellious spirit and tenacious sexuality. Similar to the vamp, the flapper's character traits were communicated through makeup. While the bee-stung lips they wore were originally a practical innovation, it combined with the flapper's downturned eyebrows and dark-rimmed eyes to portray a playful femininity. For the vamps, Josephine Baker, and the flappers, makeup was used to convey archetypal characters. These characters were often problematic, and their respective makeup styles reflected 1920s ideals on race, sexuality, and gender. While the average person didn't exactly walk down the street wearing a bold, smoky eye, these aspirational images did inspire real-life makeup trends. In other words, life imitates art, and just like the tragic demise of so many silent film heroines, so too would the 1920s come to an end. It's rare that history segments itself neatly into decades, but in the case of the Roaring 1920s, the era would come to a screeching halt in October of 1929 as the American stock market crashed. The 1920s and the decades preceding it had seen a social, political, and technological revolution that had transformed the way people viewed makeup. The cosmetics industry had grown into an international capitalist monster, and makeup culture had permanently embedded itself into public life. But as the era came to a close, the makeup world faced unprecedented challenges, including the Great Depression and the rise of fascism. How would this new industry survive the much scarier 1930s? My work wouldn't be possible without the support of my subscribers on Patreon. If you'd like to support my work directly, patrons get access to exclusive content and the ability to request short video topics. Thank you to all my patrons. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful week, and until next time, bye!